Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or GERD for short. This enormous hydroelectric dam on the Blue Nile in Ethiopia has been under construction for over a decade. Once completed, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is the largest dam in Africa, capable of generating huge amounts of electricity for Ethiopia and neighboring countries. Waters as its birthright, and has fiercely guarded its claim to the river. During the colonial era, agreements were signed giving Egypt and Sudan rights over most of the Nile's water.
حليمة المساعد وزير الخارجية المصري الأسبق ونائب رئيس المجلس المصري لشؤون
በነገራችን ላይ ይህ አሁን የሚያወራው ሰውዬ የድሮ የውጭ ጉዳይ ሚኒስትር አማካሪ እና ደግሞ በአፍሪካ ጉዳይ ላይ ተመራማሪ ምናምን ይሉትና ሌሎችም ስልጣኖች ያሉት ሰው ነው።
ولنا من القاهرة سفير صلاح حليمة المساعد
وزير أمباسادر ነው በሆኑ አገሮች ላይ
الخارجية المصري الأسبق ونائب رئيس المجلس المصري لشؤون الإفريقية. مرحبا.
አሁን በአፍሪካ ጉዳይ ላይ ደግሞ የአማካሪ ነው።
بك سيادة السفير صلاح على شاشة الغد. أبدأ معك بهذه الزيارة، الهدف والغاية منها وماذا حول دلالات توقيتها؟
መጀመሪያ የኤርትራ ማነው የኤርትራን ፕሬዝዳንት ኢሳያስን ለማየት የውጭ ጉዳይ ሚኒስትሩ የግብጽ ማለት ነው እንደዚሁም ደግሞ የደህንነቱ አካል እዚህ ጋር እንደምታዩቸው እዚህ ጋር እንዴት ላሳያችሁ እንደዚህ ላሳያችሁ እነዚህ ናቸው። ኢሳያስ አፈወርቂ መሃል ላይ ጉብ ብሏል። ሲኤንኤን አረብኛ በጽሁፍ እንደዚህ አድርጎ ዘግቦታል። ሐውለ ሱማሌ ይላል። የሚገርመኝ እሱ ፓርት ነው እና እዚህ ጋር የሄዱት ስለ ሱማሌ ሊመካከሩ እንደሆነ ነው የጻፈው ሲኤንኤን ጽሁፉን አንብቤዋለሁና ሐውለ ሱማል ወልባህር الأحمر በሶማሌና በቀይ ባህር ጉዳይ رئيس المخابرات المصرية የደህንነቱ ዋና ኃላፊ ወይም የሰላዮቹ ዋና ኃላፊና ወወዚር الخارجية እንደዚሁም የግብጽ የውጭ ጉዳይ ሚኒስትሩ እና ኢሚግሬሽን ምናምን ኃላፊው የዙራን ማለት ሁለቱም ይሄዳሉ ኤርትራን ሲጎበኙ ነው የሚያሳየን። ስለዚህ ምን ይላዋል ጠያቂው? ይሄ ምን የሚሉት መሄድ ነው እንደገና ጊዜውስ እንዴት ታይቷል ማለት ተውቂቱ ማለት ለምን በዚህ ሰዓት ይሄን አይነት አክሽን ወሰዳችሁ እንደማለት ነው።
اهلا بحضراتكم الساده المشاهدين.
سلام.
اعتقد هذه زياره ذات طبيعه امنيه سياسيه.
ይህ ጉብኝት የደህንነት ጉዳይ ጋር የተያዘ ፖለቲካዊ ስትራቴጂን ያዘለና የጋራ ጉዳይ የሆነ ነገር ላይ ለማውራት ነው።
ما تشهده منطقه البحر الاحمر
አንደኛ በቀይ ባህር ላይ ባለው እና በሚከሰቱ ጉዳይ ይሄ አክቹአሊ ኦፊሻል የሆነ ሰውም ስለሆነ የፖለቲካ ምን ይባላል የፖለቲካ ሰው ነው ማለት አምባሳደር ሆኖ ይሰራ ምናምን ስለዚህ የሚናገረንም መሆንም ማለት ምን ጠብቀው ማለት ነው። ንግግሩ በተቻለ መጠን በጣም ጥብቅ ነው ኦፊሻል ነው። ስለዚህ ዝም ብሎ እንደነዛ እንደ ሁሉ ጊዜ እንደምንሰማቸው ሰዎች እንትን አይለንም ብዙ ነገሮች ይነግረን አይችልም። ኦኬ
من تطورات من شأنها زعزعة الأمن والاستقرار وتمارس
በአካባቢው ላይ አካባቢውን የሚያምሱ የሚያበላሹ የሆኑ ነገሮችን በተመለከተ በነገራችን ላይ ይሄንን ሲል ቅድም በአረብኛ ላይ ያስታወሰኝ የሞሮኮ የኢትዮጵያ የሞሮኮ ስምምነትን በተመለከተ በሰፊው ያራገቡት ነው። አንድ ቪዲዮ በትንሹ እንድታዩት ይዤላችሁ መጥቻና የሚሉት ምንድነው ኢትዮጵያውን ከኢትዮጵያ ምን ልትጠቀሙ ነው የምትሄዱት እና ከነሱ ጋር ወታደራዊ ስምምነት የምታደርጉት እናንተስ እሺ ተጠቅሟቸው ይሆናል ግን ከኢትዮጵያ ሞሮኮ ምን ትጠቀማለች? ለምሳሌ ግብጽና ኢትዮጵያ ጦርነት ውስጥ ሊገቡ ሞሮኮ ከሷ ጋር ስምምነት ፈርሚያለሁ ብላ የግብጽ ወታደርን ልትወጋ ነው ማለት ነው። እንደዚህ አይነት ጥያቄዎች ጠይቁ ነበርና the same thing ወይ ራሱን ጥያቄ ልንጠይቃቸው ይገባል። ግብጾች ከኤርትራ ጋር ኤርትራ በልጣቸው ነው እነሱ ከዓለም አንደኛ ነን ወይም ዘጠነኛ ነን ከአፍሪካ አንደኛ ነን የሚሉ አካሎች ኤርትራ ምን ወሰደች? ኤርትራ ምን ሊጠቀሙ ነው የሚሄዱት? ኤርትራ የተሻለ ነገር ልትሰጣቸው ነው ወይስ ምናምን ምን ጥያቄ ሊጠየቁ ይገባል። ስለዚህ ጉዳዩ እንደሆነ ስትራቴጂ ጉዳይ ነው። በዚህ በኩል በድንበር በምናምን ማነስ የሚችሉት በኤርትራ በኩል ነው በሌላ በኩል አይደለም። ስለዚህ ከሌላው ጊዜ የበለጠ በጣም በሰፊው የኢትዮ ኤርትራ ድንበር ጉዳይ መንግስት ከምን ጊዜው በላይ የበለጠ ከባድ የሆነ ጥንቃቄ ሊያደርግበት ይገባል።
Tensions have escalated as Somalia has forged closer ties with Ethiopia's other rival, Egypt. Now, last month, Cairo sent military aid to Mogadishu to mark the strengthening of ties. Egypt also reportedly plans to send up to 5,000 soldiers to join a new-look African Union force in Somalia at the end of the year, with another 5,000 to be deployed separately.
Tensions that have flared between Ethiopia and Somalia since the beginning of this year. In January, Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed signed a Memorandum of Understanding with Somaliland, a self-governing but unrecognized breakaway republic that declared independence from Somalia in 1991. The deal would see Somaliland lease 20 miles of coastline to landlocked Ethiopia and access to the port of Berbera for commercial and military purposes. In exchange, the deal would reportedly see Ethiopia recognize Somaliland as a sovereign country. Now, these would be pretty major developments. For Ethiopia, it would mark the restoration of access to the sea, which was lost after Eritrea won its independence in the early 90s. For Somaliland, it would be the first time a UN member state had recognized its sovereignty. But the Memorandum of Understanding was met with a furious reaction from Somalia, which obviously doesn't recognize Somaliland's independence. The Somali government described it as an illegal act of aggression, declared the deal null and void, vowed to block the deal, recalled its ambassador from Ethiopia, and denied air traffic clearance for an Ethiopian Airlines flight carrying an Ethiopian delegation to Somaliland. So tensions were running high between Ethiopia and Somalia when regional power Egypt stepped in support of Somalia, with Egypt's President Sisi saying no one will agree to Ethiopia's move and that Egypt would provide support in case of aggression against one of the Arab countries, especially when brotherly countries ask us to stand by them. Now, this is far from the first time that Egypt and Ethiopia have been on the opposite sides of a tense dispute relating to Ethiopia's unilateral actions. In fact, since 2011, the two countries have been at odds over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or GERD, a massive hydroelectric dam built by Ethiopia on the Blue Nile River, a tributary of the Nile River that flows through Sudan and Egypt before reaching the sea. The multi-billion-dollar GERD has already started generating electricity, and the overall project is more than 95% complete, with it holding the potential to double Ethiopia's electricity generation.
Citizen Daybreak, the SMS code is 22422 at Citizen TV Kenya and at Ayub Abdikadir. This morning we are focusing on developments across the Horn of Africa, given the current developments which are around security, defense relations, and also the crisis in Sudan. With me in studio this morning is Ahmed Hashi, who is a diplomacy and foreign affairs commentator. Also in his company, Dr. Hassan Kanenje, the director, Horn Institute for Strategic Studies. Good morning, gentlemen. Good and morning. Also Professor Noah Medamba, defense and foreign policy expert, as well as a senior associate at the Global Center for Policy Studies. Your time is all appreciated, gentlemen, and thank you.
Good morning. Asante.
Let's begin with what's happening in the Horn of Africa. According to recent developments, already volatile region characterized by instability is experiencing what could potentially risk further destabilization. With the drawdown of the African Union transition mission in Somalia ongoing, Egypt and Somalia have signed a military agreement that will see Cairo deploy 5,000 troops in a new-look peacekeeping mission post-ATMIS. The move has angered Ethiopia, which neighbors Somalia and makes up countries whose troops are serving in Somalia under ATMIS, terming the Mogadishu-Cairo deal as a threat to its existence, saying it will not stand idle while other actors take measures to destabilize the region. In the last 24 hours, the government in Addis also responded to a letter by Egypt to the UN Security Council, saying its developments are in line with the UN Charter on Developments and will not stop in its pursuit for socio-economic growth. At the start of the year, Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed signed a controversial port deal with the breakaway region of Somaliland, a move that angered Mogadishu, prompting a military deal that saw Somalia sign an agreement with Egypt in a deal that Abiy said will lease a 20-kilometer portion in exchange for recognition of Somaliland, a move that angered the federal authority in Mogadishu. That will be what our discussion will center around, gentlemen, and many thanks for your presence here. Again, Ahmed, what do you make of all these developments, given the already volatility in the region that risks further destabilization, and what does this mean happening at the doorstep of Kenya?
other countries, Ayub, have caused bedlam in our region. Now, it is absolutely against every principle of international law, of the African Union, of the IGAD, of nation states, and any decent law that some political leader takes a piece of land that is sovereign and wants to add it to another country and say, this is yours and you can do as you please. Particularly because the Somali people are chafing under the division of their nation into 5 parts historically. Djibouti, Western Somalia, the NFD, and now what used to be called British Somaliland back in the day of colonialism. Now, I think that this is not in the interest of the international community. We have to put Humpty Dumpty back together, no matter what the cost is. Anybody claiming that secessionism is going to help the Somali people just doesn't understand the dynamics of the clans and their history. And about Ayub, I beg your pardon, the problem is that today we have an imbalance of the major clans within the Somali Republic because of the failure of leadership in Mogadishu and secessionism in the north, and the whole idea of having a federal state or a federal system in Somalia is actually just probably the most obtuse form of policy I have come across. Secondly, Egypt is just taking advantage of our region. Egypt has no business coming down here and causing problems. We as East Africans can solve these problems on our own. I think that the dam in the Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia, which is something that we're all very proud of, and we hope that the Kenya government connects to it so that our electricity problems can go yonder, is something that the Egyptians are scared totally about. In Professor Midamba's area in Nyanza, they have 30 to 40 Egyptians who go every morning to Lake Nyanza and dip their to check where the level of the water is. The bread that the Egyptians eat is connected to that Nile. There will be no oil wars. The wars of today is about water. Thirdly and lastly is I think that Ethiopia's political leadership has collapsed. I mean, the very fabric of Ethiopian society is opening up. We know that the Fano of the Amhara region is maybe 100 kilometers away from Addis Ababa. Mr. Abiy is playing the rhetoric of nationalism that has very deep roots inside Ethiopia, which in the same vocabulary as the late Haile Selassie, who believed that Ethiopia extended up to Moyale here in Lamu, and that the Somali people were part of his subjects. Now, until that atypical idea is overthrown and toppled, and the Ethiopian state and its people learn to live within the country that they have, we're going to have war clouds on the horizon, and I predict that there's going to be a military conflict in the Horn, and the government of Kenya and its Ministry of Foreign Affairs is sleeping on the job.
Okay, Dr. Kanenje, coming to you. A lot in the mix-up because the Egyptians more or less see the GERD as an existential threat because they say it affects their agriculture, and then prompting the military deal. Is it in a way also taking advantage of the nature of Somalia itself, given institutions that still are not as functional as they ought to be because of the civil war, and a military power here, which is the second biggest beneficiary after Israel from the United States, largely appearing to be funding or taking part of a conflict, and in a region that is largely unstable because of other actors that have been destabilizing it?
Just perhaps to correct something, second largest beneficiary, you mean
military aid?
Military aid, and I think, because listeners might not really have the background, but this goes back to Camp David in 1978, accords that guaranteed certain military assistance, to both countries, even though they weren't
The Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is the largest dam in Africa, capable of generating huge amounts of electricity for Ethiopia and neighboring countries. Well,
I think that the number of things that, we should not really, conflict. You have one, the general state of dysfunction in the Horn that allows not just Egypt or Cairo, but virtually everybody to actually try to stake a claim, and intervene and have a free reign in parts of the Horn of Africa, in part because of the challenges we're facing in terms of security, in terms of economics, in terms of just being able to actually have a cohesive, governance, structure. Second, it has to do with the Great Renaissance, Dam. The Nile is really critical to Egypt's survival. That goes without question. There is no Egypt without the Nile. But there is Nile without Egypt, you see. Now there's a difference. Now, one thing that sometimes I think we shy away from, and Egypt is a country that is friendly to Kenya, as well as Ethiopia, and is an important player on the continent, is part of the founding of the Organization of African Unity, that later on, remember the days of Gamal Abdel Nasser and stuff. But there is a sense, especially countries that have a stake in the Nile, that the 1929 and 1959 treaties really did not factor in the interests of the countries, such as Ethiopia, as well as the rest that have a stake in it. And Ethiopia, I think Addis sought to try and correct that, in part because a lot of water of the Nile comes also from Ethiopia. And Ethiopia is a country with 120 million people, but only 45% electrified, compared to Egypt, which is almost 100% now, today as we speak. And because energy is very critical to economics, Addis looked at it as this is an opportunity for us to actually make a difference. And someone has to give it to Addis for literally raising money, sourcing locally to build the dam, $5 billion.
And that's since 2011.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so it's a very nationalistic kind of project. So it is not something that Addis is likely to give up. Now, the disagreement has been the number of years they're supposed to take in terms of filling the dam. The water. It's not about using or building the Grand Renaissance Dam itself. So there has been a disagreement over that, and that has created the kind of fissures you see between Cairo and Addis Ababa. Now, seeing the dynamics of the region as well as the dynamics of the Red Sea, it is very convenient for Cairo, to seek to exploit, some of these tensions that are existing from a very, I would say, nationalistic self-interest, kind of, to do that. It's doing this for the first time, for instance, in Somalia in 50 years, probably almost since independence. This is not something that has happened, in recent years. But it is a trend that has actually been, happening as Cairo has been moving to deepen its engagements with Horn countries. It's not just, it's only now they're sending military and probably assets, or they're willing to do that. But the engagements with countries in Eastern Africa has actually been expanded in recent years. And so, yes, one has to do with the chaos in our region, which are being exploited. Two, it has to do with the strategic interest of Egypt, especially in relation to the use of the waters of the Nile.
Okay, yes, Professor Mnaba, given all these circumstances and the military deal then thereafter, which had raised concerns in Addis Ababa, issuing a communique saying that this is unwelcome given the circumstances it cited. But how does it address the question of Somaliland as well? Because the federal authority in Mogadishu says that is an aggression on its sovereign territorial integrity, yet Ethiopia is still forging ahead with that in a deal, according to what they signed between Abiy and Musa Bihi, that will last for 50 years for Ethiopia to access the sea, as Dr. pointed out, to cater for the needs of its 120 million people or thereabout. I mean, how will all this fit into that one basket, given the complexity of the region that we live in?
Thank you, Ayub. First, I want to thank you for having us in this wonderful studio. And then create a high command so that there is a level where military need to serve. There's a level where Navy, there's a level where Air Force need to serve.
Okay.
We cannot move anywhere. We'll kill each other.
Okay. Ahmed, how can the tension then be diffused, given that the internal dynamics in Ethiopia also is somewhat having an effect on what's happening in the region and the growing opposition to Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, who in the aftermath of coming to power in 2018, an ethnic Oromo who had decried systematic state exclusion from the center when the TPLF were in power, and therefore, according to a majority of Ethiopians, failing to live by the very book and the very reforms that he promised to bring in, but fell out with the TPLF. There was a war in Tigray.
Yeah.
Now, internal dynamics, you mentioned the Oromo movement and what's happening in Somalia at the moment. How can this then be diffused? And how should Kenya also pay attention to all these developments, given the neutral status it always assumes, and how former President Uhuru Kenyatta midwifed the talks between the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed's government, the federal government, and the TPLF, the South Africa talks, the Nairobi talks, which more or less led to ending of the war. I mean, is Kenya keen on what's happening, and how can the tension be diffused?
Ayub, in his great novel, the West African writer Usman Semben, Allah Yarhamah, in his book, I think it's called God's Bits of Woods. I don't know if they teach that anymore in secondary school. We used to study these things. Said, you know, there might be hunger and there might be thirst, but the great misfortune is not knowing who wants you to be hungry and thirsty. And I think that Mr. Abiy is probably one of the great mistakes of Ethiopian political economy. And the reason I say this is that he came in a wave of such optimism that the entire Ethiopian nation was just clapping for that man. He didn't even walk around with security. He would wear a kitenge shirt. It was a breath of fresh air. Nobody had seen a 40-something-year-old young man take power in one of the most complex societies in Africa. There's over 2,000 tribes in Ethiopia. Mm-hmm. Ethiopia, you know, was named by the Greeks, the land of burnt faces. That's what it means, Ethiop. It's a Greek word. That's how ancient Ethiopia is. Every person in Ethiopia thought that Prime Minister Abiy, including myself, was a great supporter at the beginning. Even though I kept on warning that the political economy and as you remember, that the structures underneath Abiy would not allow for him to make those kinds of reform, because Ethiopia has been basically a state governed by the two ethnic groups in northern Ethiopia, which have been the Tigray and the Amhara. Mm-hmm. And within those two groups, there is this concept of a local empire. Remember, Ethiopia was the only country that participated in the Berlin Conference. Mm-hmm. And one of the concepts of empire that the Ethiopians have always believed in is to have a nation state that stretches from up there in the mountains all the way down to Lamu, including Moyale and all these other places. So the very idea of Ethiopia is if I can use as a threat to her neighbor's national sovereignty. I believe that. And I think Somalia shared the same kind of thinking. Now, the realities on the ground are very different. The internal combustion in Ethiopia, Ayub, is going to make Ethiopia a failed state before the end of this year or early next year. And this is about 200 million people in that country. Different. The internal combustion in Ethiopia, Ayub, is going to make Ethiopia a failed state before the end of this year. The internal combustion in Ethiopia, Ayub, is going to make Ethiopia a failed state before the end of this year or early next year. And this is about 200 million people in that country. You can imagine the kind of catastrophe that would cause for Africa. Ethiopia is the heart of Africa. Mm-hmm. If it stops beating, the entire provisional experiment that we in this continent want, that you can have a multi-ethnic, multi-religious, open market, mm-hmm. plural system with a free press, with a free system of voting. All these ideas that we want to bring, and this new generation wants, if Ethiopia collapses under the weight of the past, it will mean that the experiment that we in every country in Africa will be under threat. Secondly, I think Ethiopia has no business looking for territory in Somalia. They already swallowed the third largest region in Ethiopia with 25 million Somalis. There's no business looking for more territory to swallow. It's absolutely not. And that will cause a terrible war. The Somalis are about 10,000 years old. They've lived as a neighbor to Ethiopia. They have fought great battles, the last one being the 1977 one. And I think that Ethiopia is wrong to take territory from the Somali country and say that we're going to put a military base here and we're going to put a navy here, and Eritrea is already up in arms. Eritrea has already warned Djibouti, told them that if you give them any territory, there's going to be a state of war.
Bounded by the Red Sea, the Gulf of Aden, and the Indian Ocean, the region has a vast strategic and economic importance. Now, its unique location has attracted the interest of several foreign actors, from the US to China, but also several middle powers. One such actor is Turkey, which has been making significant strides and is deepening its involvement in the region. In the latest, Turkey is reportedly planning to build a site to test fire missiles and space rockets in Somalia, a country that sits on Africa's eastern tip. As per reports, Ankara and Mogadishu have held discussions regarding this plan. Now, Turkish officials say that they are optimistic that Somalia will agree to this project. However, both nations have not publicly confirmed the reports. But the sources close to the Turkish government have revealed that Ankara's ballistic missile program requires long-range testing, and Somalia's location allows firing toward the Indian Ocean, making it ideal for its plan. Turkey has been working on increasing the range of its domestically built Typhoon missiles from about 560 kilometers. Somalia is also a suitable site for a spaceport, as it is close to the equator. Testing near the equator can also help to boost the range and efficiency of space rockets. Turkey has long sought to join the global space race and has been preparing for a rocket launch for several years. In 2021, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan announced an ambitious 10-year plan for his country's space program. Reports at the time also suggested that the program would require building a rocket launch site in Somalia. Now, reports said that Turkey would build a spaceport in Somalia as a part of a $1 billion plan to achieve a soft moon landing by the year 2028. The building and maintenance of such a port would cost around $350 million. Now, the latest reports highlight Turkey is making progress with its plan. It is one of the few foreign powers strengthening ties with Somalia. Now, Mogadishu already hosts Turkey's largest overseas military base. The two countries have also signed several agreements in the past months, including a defense and security cooperation agreement and an offshore energy cooperation deal. In July, the Turkish parliament also approved a presidential motion to allow the Turkish armed forces to send naval forces to Somalia for 2 years as a part of the joint defense agreement. Ankara has also built schools, hospitals, and infrastructure and provided scholarships for Somalis to study in Turkey. On the diplomatic front, Ankara is mediating a dispute between Somalia and Ethiopia. Now, both the neighbors are locked in a dispute over a port deal that Ethiopia struck with Somalia's breakaway region, Somaliland. In exchange of the port, Ethiopia agreed officially to recognize Somaliland, a move that has angered Somalia. So, be it diplomacy, infrastructure, defense, or people-to-people ties, Turkey is boosting its presence in the Horn of Africa. Observers believe that Ankara is also trying to replicate such a role in other African nations. Will middle powers like Turkey be able to make a big impact in Africa? And what larger geopolitical implications will it have? Now, for more on this, we have
interesting out of Turkey. What do we know so far, and what is the justification for them putting these bases in Somalia?
Jumana, what we know so far is Turkey's president says they're working on increasing the range for their domestically built Typhoon missile. Previously, they've tested it on the Black Sea with a range of 561 kilometers, but they need to test it in long ranges. And that's where Somalia comes in. It sits at an ideal location off the shores of the Indian Ocean. So that solves the range problem without increasing the risk of the debris falling in residential areas. And this is also a two-way deal. Outside of the ballistic missiles, Turkey is a new player in this race to space, and they're looking to fire some hybrid rockets to space. Hence, they want to build a spaceport in Somalia.
Interesting. So is this part of a bigger partnership deal between Turkey and Somalia? Are there going to be more deals that are going to come on the back of this, or are we just starting with this initial step with the view that perhaps later on they can build on that relationship?
Absolutely, Jumana, but they're building up on this relationship. They've just signed a partnership to enhance economic and defense cooperation for the next decade. But this partnership dates back to all the way in 2011 when Turkey's president visited Somalia, and we began seeing funding going into key sectors like education, like healthcare, like security. And it's important to know that if we zoom in on security, Turkey is playing a mediator role between Somalia and Ethiopia over their tiff with Somaliland. They've also built their biggest overseas base in Somalia, and they're helping their troops fight Al-Shabaab and also rebuild their country. But they also have their eyes set on natural resources. They'll be dispatching a hydrocarbon ship to search for oil and gas, and they're also looking at mining corporations in other parts of Africa like Niger.
Links the ancient past of Ethiopia to its current situation, and therefore is, of course, highly controversial, but still a figure of great respect across Africa.
And let's just focus on Ethiopia these days. I mean, it's no stranger to conflict. We've seen the violence in the Tigray region in recent years. There's also violence along the border with Sudan. Perhaps this is a loaded question, but how do you see Ethiopia coming out of this, and will it ever reach a kind of stability?
Well, Ethiopia has never been really a stable country. The princes always used to fight each other, and after the Menelik regime came, emperor was in the 19th century, they expanded to a huge area. The size of Ethiopia doubled, if not trebled, and they took in, from being, say, a dozen nationalities, they took in nearly 90 nationalities. Now you can imagine how destabilizing that has been, and the fight between the center and the periphery, in a sense, and all these different groups has continued ever since. At the same time, it is growing fast now under Prime Minister Abiy. There are a lot of questions about how he has ruled as well, and he is now in conflict with Somalia over whether Somaliland should become an independent state, which is a very controversial issue. The current prime minister would like to have an Ethiopian navy once more, even though it has no coastline. So there are all sorts of strange elements to the Ethiopian situation. And the Egyptians are now on a collision course with the Ethiopians because a huge dam has been built across the Blue Nile. Now, it's only a hydroelectric dam, so it doesn't use the water, but the Egyptians are furious that they do not any longer control one of the main tributaries to the Nile, which is, in essence, their only source of water, since almost no water falls on Egypt itself. So you can imagine this is a very, very difficult situation for the Ethiopians to find themselves in, but they are enormously resourceful people. They have great intelligence and capability to overcome the most difficult circumstances. And I'm sure that in due course, Ethiopia will be a powerful and prosperous country and remain a leader of Africa.
All right.
Of course, Ethiopia will be a powerful and prosperous country and remain a leader of Africa. Of course, Ethiopia will be a powerful and prosperous country and remain a leader of Africa.
All right. Yeah!